And this is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 9th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. So our Christmas pageant this past year was different from anything that we have ever done before. Because of COVID, we had a virtual pageant in which we asked people to record readings and to play music. And while those things were being read or the music was being played, we put in pictures from Christmas pageants past that everybody could watch. In fact, Christmas pageants from the past 20 years. For better or worse, I ended up being the tech guy who inserted all of those pictures into the video. Thankfully, I was not the person who had to go through 20 years of pictures and select them. Lisa Connery was the person who did that. And because I have been here for most of the previous 20 years, it really was amazing to take a trip down memory lane as I was putting all those pictures together. But one of the things that stood out for me the most was how things really have changed, even when I haven't noticed them. After all, most change happens pretty slowly, so it's easy to be able to feel like, well, this year is pretty much like the last year, the year before that. But as I got a glimpse of those pictures, even from just 5 or 6 years ago, I was struck by realities like, wow, the kids really have grown. There were a number of adults who had that experience also. I was like, I remember them when they were that small, but it seemed like they're always, how did that happen so fast? But it had happened. I was struck by realities like, oh yeah, that's what that space or that's what that area of the property looked like before we did some renovation or some repair or something. It just seemed to me like it's always been like that. But when I look at those pictures, I realize, oh yeah, that's the way it used to be. And things really are different now. And of course, sadly, I need to confess that one of the major things that I thought was, wow, I really did have more hair back then, and a whole lot less of it was gray. Sometimes life is like that. You don't recognize what's changed until you see a picture of what was and what is. Only then does it become apparent how things have really changed, and perhaps how your life has changed as well. Usually, when we read the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, we focus on how Jesus' appearance changed, was transfigured, literally metamorphosized, right? Perhaps even Jesus' change in that moment. But in fact, Jesus was always God's Son. Jesus always possessed the glory of God. Jesus was always in divine communication with God. It's just that in that moment, Peter and James and John got to see it more clearly. It's as though they saw a picture of who Jesus really was all the time, even if he didn't usually glow or have conversations with Old Testament figures. But I think that this picture is more than that. In one respect, the picture doesn't so much show the disciples who Jesus is, as much as it shows the disciples how much their lives have already changed. It might have seemed to Peter and James and John that following Jesus had been an exciting adventure, but their lives were pretty much the same as they were just a few years ago. But that really wasn't true. Knowing Jesus really had changed their lives. Following Jesus had made them different. Being Jesus' disciples had already begun to transfigure or metamorphosize their lives. The picture on the mountain, that picture they saw of Jesus, probably made it clear to them not only how much Jesus may have been different in that moment, but how much their lives also had begun to change. And the story of the Transfiguration is important for us because God is also working in our lives to change and transform us. Through following Jesus, God is calling us to live differently and to be different than we were before. But often, God's work in our lives is a gradual thing, and it takes time. Sometimes it takes a picture to show us how much God has already been doing. Now, sometimes the pictures that show us how God has been acting to change and transform can be dramatic, like that mountaintop experience that we read about in today's gospel. At other times, the pictures God uses may be, the actual photographs of just a few years ago. And maybe more often, the pictures that God uses may be the momentary realization that God really has helped me to be more confident in faith, more loving toward my neighbor, or more secure in God's presence in the midst of adversity. And so the Transfiguration isn't just a story about how Jesus has been changed. And it's not just a story about how the first disciples were being changed. Rather, the Transfiguration is a call to each of us to watch for the pictures of how God is acting and has already acted to transform us into the people God calls us to be. And sometimes that picture comes into clearer focus when we ask ourselves some questions. Like sometimes the picture comes into focus for me when I ask myself, what have I done lately that I really would not have done, except that I really believe Jesus wants me to do it? Because honestly, I confess, there are times where I'm thinking, I don't want to do that thing, but I know Jesus wants me to do it. And because I'm willing to do it, that's a sign, that's a picture that Jesus really is changing my life. Sometimes the question is, have I been able to handle adversity in my life differently because I feel God's help and presence in a way that maybe I didn't feel so strongly before? Or perhaps, do I have a different perspective on life than my friends who are not Christians or who don't believe in God at all? Sometimes those questions show me the picture. The Transfiguration is God's call in our life, also in ours, to listen for the voice of Jesus, to continue to grow even and especially when it's not clear where we're going. I mean, it wasn't clear to the disciples. And as they went down that mountain and followed Jesus, the voice told them to listen to Jesus. But what that meant was more than just the words that Jesus said. It also meant watching what Jesus did and observing how Jesus handled situations. So in our lives, how is it that we listen for Jesus? Do we take seriously the notion that God uses everything from the words of the Bible to the words of our fellow Christians to speak to us in our lives? Do we look around in our daily lives for signs of how God may be calling us to act and to make a positive difference? Do we spend time in prayer actually listening for God instead of just reciting a laundry list of all the things we want from God? The Transfiguration is God's call in our lives as well to hope for and expect God to do even greater things with us. The follow-on to today's story is that the disciples go down and go, what the heck is this rising from the dead stuff? And they discuss this among themselves. They're all confused about what it means. But they know that something dramatically better is coming, even if in the short term, things are going to get worse. And in a world that so often asks us to focus on the problems and the tragedies, do we celebrate the signs of hope? Are we willing to be signs of hope even when we feel like the world is falling apart around us? And are we actually expecting God to create an amazing new future for us and for the rest of the world, even and especially when we know that there is no way that we ourselves can bring that future about. The Transfiguration calls us also and always to ask those kinds of questions in our lives. For even when it's not dramatic, God is always showing us pictures of how Jesus has already been changing our lives. And that's because, like those first disciples, actually knowing Jesus really does change us. Following Jesus really does make us different. And being Jesus' disciples is intended to transfigure our lives as well. Amen.